Lies are often harmless, painful at worst, or maybe even heartbreaking, but lies are rarely fatal. The story of Chernobyl is an example of how a web of lies can have tragic consequences. The corruption, arrogance, and greed of the Soviet Union spread so deep that even 37 years later, we can't even pinpoint accurately how many people were killed as a result of the disaster. Some say 4,000, others say 200,000. Today we are tackling this web of deceit and trying to uncover the truth buried beneath the surface. Let's start from the beginning. The year is 1986, and during the night of April 25th to the morning of April 26th, inside the control room of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, there was a test on the way to see if the plant's cooling system could remain powered in case of a full power outage, in the event of war or some other disaster. This test was attempted 1 year prior, but was a failure due to electrical faults. During this test, a series of severe and catastrophic mistakes, coupled with arrogance, led to the deaths of countless people. But who's to blame? Let's start by learning who was in the control room that night. Anatoly Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer in control of the safety test. He was responsible for supervising the test and making crucial decisions during the events leading up to the explosion. He was the head of the chain of command that night. Then second in command was Alexander Akamov, the shift supervisor on duty that night. As shift supervisor, he held responsibilities for overseeing the operation of the reactor and managing the actions of the other men operating the control room during the events leading up to the explosion. Leonid Toptonov. Toptonov was a senior reactor control engineer responsible for operating the reactor. He was involved in controlling the reactor and responding to the reactor's instabilities. And then Igor Kirshenbaum. Much like Toptonov, he was also a senior reactor control engineer. These four men set in motion the sequence of events that caused the reactor to explode, changing the way humanity viewed nuclear energy and, in my opinion, hammering one of the nails in the coffin that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. Chernobyl Unit 4 was an RBMK reactor. This was a unique style of reactor that was developed in the Soviet Union. RBMK reactors were inherently more dangerous compared to the reactors of the West for a few crucial reasons. RBMKs use graphite around the fuel as a neutron moderator. This means it was used to slow down the neutrons released from the nuclear fuel undergoing fission. The problem with using graphite as a moderator, unlike water in the Western PWR reactors, was it led to a phenomenon called a positive void coefficient. Simply put, this means that as the reactor core boiled off its cooling water, reactivity went up, whereas in the PWR reactors, which has a negative void coefficient, it goes down, which is obviously much safer, because if the pumps go offline for whatever reason, in an RBMK, a meltdown is guaranteed, but in a PWR it is very unlikely to occur. And another disastrous design flaw was the fact that control rods were tipped with graphite. This was intended to counteract another phenomenon called a xenon poisoning. This occurs when a reactor is shut down fully for maintenance or refueling. During this period, xenon-135 built up within the reactor, which is a neutron absorber. This would heavily lower the reactivity of the reactor when it was restarted, because xenon would absorb the neutrons released in fission before it could split other uranium atoms, which in turn would lower its power output. To counteract this, operators could withdraw the control rods with the tips until just the tips are left inside, and because graphite is a moderator, it increases reactivity within the core, compensating for the neutron absorption by the xenon. As the xenon then decayed away over a period of a few hours, the control rods would be gradually inserted back to their original positions to bring the reactor back to a stable point. Remember this because it will tie in back into the story later. The design flaws with the RBMK became apparent on April 25th, 1986. During the safety test, the reactor's emergency core cooling system was disabled. The system provided water for cooling the core in the case of an emergency. Next, as the shutdown proceeded, the reactor was now operating at about half power, when the electrical load dispatcher that was responsible for allocating power to the grid refused to allow further shutdown, because the power was needed for the grid. It was not until around 11 PM that the grid controller finally agreed to allow further reduction in power. For the test, the reactor should have been stabilized at around 700 to 1000 megawatts before the test began. Probably due to operational error, power fell to 30 megawatts at 12:30 on the 26th. Efforts to increase the power to the level originally planned for the test were hampered by a combination of xenon poisoning, water absorbing too many neutrons, and the graphite being too cool. Many of the control rods were withdrawn to compensate for these problems, which led to a positive void coefficient, resulting in a violation of the reactor's operating procedures, although the operators may not even have known about this. At 1:03 AM, the reactor was stabilized at about 200 megawatts, and it was decided that the test would be carried out at this power level. Calculations performed after the accident showed that the ORM, which basically means how much the water in the core is reducing the reactor's reactivity, and by association the heat, at around 122 was equal to 8 manual control rods. The minimum allowed ORM in the operating procedures was 15 control rods. The test commenced at 1:23. Turbine stop valves were closed and the 4 pumps powered by the slowing turbine started to slow down as well. The slower flow rate, with slightly warmer feed water entering the core, caused boiling at the bottom of the core due to the positive void coefficient. This, along with xenon poisoning, resulted in a runaway increase in power, which caused Akimov to trigger the insertion of all the control rods by pressing the AZ5 button at 1:23. Then 3 seconds later, the emergency protection system came on, and power exceeded 530 megawatts and continued to rise. Fuel rods then ruptured, leading to increased steam generation, which in turn further increased power due to the large positive void coefficient. At this point, damage to just 3 or 4 fuel assemblies would have been enough to lead to the destruction of the core. The rupture of several fuel channels increased the pressure in the reactor to the extent that the 1,000-ton reactor support plate became detached, jamming the control rods, which were only halfway down at the time. As the water pipes began to rupture, massive amounts of steam were generated inside the core. A note in the operating log of Dyatlov read, 1:24, severe shocks. The control rods stopped moving before they reached the lower limit stop switches. Power switch off, clutch mechanism is off. Then, suddenly, 2 explosions were reported. The first being the initial steam explosion, which was so powerful, it shot the 1,000-ton reactor lid straight through the roof, where it then came straight back down and smashed all the fuel rods still inside the housing. Then, 2 or 3 seconds later, a second explosion occurred from the buildup of hydrogen in the core. Fuel, graphite and structural materials were ejected, starting a number of fires, and the destroyed core was now exposed to the atmosphere. At this point, one worker, Valery Hodemchuk, was buried under the rubble of the reactor, and his body was never recovered. Chernobyl will remain his tomb forever. Then, a second worker, Vladimir Nikolaevich, died in hospital a few hours later as a result of him being crushed by debris and being horrifically burnt in the explosions. This marked the first 2 deaths of the disaster. The plume of radioactive smoke from the burning core and building rose to about 1 kilometer into the air. The heavier debris in the plume was deposited close to the site, but lighter compounds including radioactive dust were blown far by the wind to the northwest of the plant. Fire started in what remained of the plant, giving rise to clouds of smoke and dust, and fires also broke out on the next roof because a flammable material had been used in its construction. A first group of 14 firemen arrived on the scene of their accident at 1:28. Over 100 firemen were needed, and it was this group that received the highest radiation exposure. Reinforcements were brought in until around 4 AM when 250 firemen were available, and 69 firemen participated in fire control. The fire was finally quenched at around 5 AM. On the 28th of April, a massive accident management operation began. This involved dropping large amounts of different materials, each one designed to combat a different feature of the fire and the radioactive release. The total amount of materials dumped on the reactor was around 5,000 tons. Including about 40 tons of boron carbide, 2,400 tons of lead, 1,800 tons of sand and clay, and about 800 tons of dolomite. About 1,800 helicopter flights were carried out to dump materials onto the reactor. During the first few flights, the helicopter would remain stationary over the reactor while dumping the material. This would cause the helicopter pilot to receive incredibly high doses of radiation. Because of this, it was decided that the material should be dumped while the helicopters were still moving over the reactor. During one of these dumping runs, one of the helicopter's rotors struck a cable that's suspended by a crane and fell out of the sky, killing everyone on board. On the 6th of May, the core temperature had fallen, and there was a sharp reduction in the rate of radioactive release, and work began on a massive reinforced concrete slab with a built-in cooling system beneath the reactor. To accomplish this, a tunnel was dug under the reactor from Unit 3. About 400 people worked on this tunnel, which was completed in 15 days, allowing the installation of the concrete slab. The slab would not only be of use to cool the core, if necessary, it would also be used as a barrier to prevent penetration of uranium lava into the groundwater. By the end of July, Hodomchuk, Nikolaevich, 6 firemen, and a further 22 staff members were dead, as a result of the incredible amount of radiation they were exposed to. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. In the next video, I'm going to be more focusing on the cleanup itself, how many people were used, what took place, and how long it took to finally render the area safe for human activity. Until then, I hope you have a good day, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.